Welcome back to the Brave Traveler Podcast, Episode 6. For fans of the supernatural, tales of fantasy and adventure, and stories of creatures mythological. I'm Dave Murray, your host, and the author of Majesty. I'm glad you're here. We finally reached the part where the story picks up and the adventure begins for our two brave travelers. My wife always said the first few chapters were a little slow. I figure she's right like 87.9% of the time. So I don't argue. If you like this content, please subscribe, hit the notification button, be sure to share it with others, and give a thumbs up. With that, let's buckle up and get going. Episode 6. Majesty, the Sorcerer and the Saint. Chapter 6. The Wizard's Table. The sky over Coravandia was dark and grim, but not as grim as the wizard's throne room. Many things had happened while the angel was gone. The creatures had begun to yell and argue about the angel and the human child. Most of them had never seen a child of God, and the last time the dwarfs had seen an angel was during the Wizard Wars. Now there was both a child of God and an angel in the same place at the same time, and that was cause for worry. The clamor grew even louder when the ogres joined in, bellowing and howling, and making so much useless noise that Katie had to let go of Bronwyn's neck to cover her ears. Enraged, the bear turned and roared.
"That is quite enough,"
the great bear said, and the hall fell silent.
"We need not be afraid. The angel has not come to destroy us. He is our champion."
After years of ruling over his kingdom, the bear had learned to make great speeches, and now that everyone was listening, he was just warming up to it.
"What the wizard hath wrought, he hath borne out of his own sinful heart, and brought upon himself. His own wickedness and evil deeds have found him out. He who has seized the throne with sorcery and exalted himself will be brought low this day. I tell you, the wizard is most pitiful among us, for his fate is in the hands of God, and there is nothing he can do to escape judgment."
Hear,
Hear, hear, hear.
the faithful dwarfs yelled. The little fairy smiled at Bronwyn and admired the brave king who spoke so boldly before the wizard. At the same time, she thought it strange that the wizard had not interrupted or even uttered a single word in his own defense. And when she looked, she saw the hooked-nosed goblin sitting atop the throne in the wizard's place, grinning wildly. The fairy flew to the goblin in an instant and zipped around the creature like a fiery dart. Numlock ducked and dodged to get out of her way as the fairy searched high and low, looking everywhere, only to discover that the wizard was indeed gone. He was nowhere to be found. But even worse, the child was gone as well.
"Furthermore,"
King Bronwyn said. Kitch flew to the bear in the middle of his lengthy speech, but no matter what she did, he turned aside and kept talking. Finally, she buzzed around Bronwyn's muzzle so fast the bear's whiskers caught fire. Bronwyn jumped back, sputtering and shaking his head angrily, then crossed his eyes to get a better look at his whiskers, which were still smoldering. Gimble took one look at the cross-eyed bear and laughed. Gogarth elbowed the little dwarf and frowned, while Bronwyn turned to the fairy in anger.
"How dare you! Such impudence!"
he roared, rubbing his nose with his paw.
They're gone! They're gone!
Kit shouted, pointing to the goblin. Bronwyn looked to the throne, then glanced around him.
But the child was right here. She had hold of my neck,"
Bronwyn said. Just then, someone cried, "What of the angel?"
We've lost the child of God. What do we do now?
The question was enough to cause a panic, as half of the creatures chose that moment to run, while others yelled and screamed even louder. Bronwyn did his best to calm them, but it was no use. They all feared the worst. With that, the little fairy took to the air and knew she had to get above all the noise of all the creatures. She flew higher and higher, all the way up to the dark rafters, then fluttered her wings to clear the dust, and sat quietly in the shadows, with the noise of the crowd still clamoring up from below. The little fairy plugged her ears and tried to concentrate. She focused her mind until the noise was little more than a distant echo, and when she was ready, she began to listen for the wizard. The fairy listened ever so carefully, her heart and mind so keen she could hear summer leaves changing colors in the cool autumn hills. Softly, quietly, she began to hear beyond the walls of the castle chamber, and listened. The mind of the wizard was a cold, dark place, filled with unspeakable horrors, and the little fairy wanted no part of it. But sitting there, among the shadows, she knew she had to keep listening if she was going to find Katy and rescue the child. The noise had been so loud Katy couldn't stand it. She had covered her ears and shut her eyes, and wished that all of the creatures and all of the yelling and all of the noise would go away. Then all at once it did. The silence had come so quickly, Katy uncovered her ears and opened her eyes, but had to shut them again to escape the brilliant sunlight. The light of day was even more of a surprise. She had just been in the dark throne room and hadn't moved an inch, yet she could feel the warmth of the sun on her face, and could have sworn she saw trees and flowers all around her. There was the occasional chirping of birds and a sweet fragrance on the air. Katy opened her eyes more slowly and squinted at the beauty that suddenly surrounded her. Her heart leapt. She was no longer in the wizard's throne room. She was bathed in sunlight and sitting in a quiet meadow, with no earthly idea of how she had gotten there. There were roses and wildflowers all around. When Katy looked down, she found herself seated in a chair that looked more like a throne, that was expertly made and flawless. Exquisitely handcrafted wood adorned the high back of the chair. Its arms and legs were carved into huge ornate claws, and the cushions beneath her were made of rich red velvet, with lace fringe and gold-braided tassels that dangled from the corners. Stretching out before her was the longest, most elegant banquet table Katy had ever seen. 3 large crystal vases were filled with exotic flowers, luscious blooms that burst with color. And set all around them, on silver platters and bowls, was every kind of food and dessert imaginable, a bountiful meal fit for a king. Everything was perfect, down to the slightest detail, and would have truly been wonderful if it were not for the evil wizard who sat at the other end of the table sipping a cup of green tea. Just the sight of him was enough to make Katy's blood run cold. Gelzuin smiled and waved to her. It was a little wave that said, "Hello there again." Katy thought about jumping out of her chair and running away, but since she didn't know where she was, she grabbed the chair arms, closed her eyes, and tried to concentrate on what the angel had said. "Say nothing, say nothing," she repeated over and over again, as though the words themselves would protect her from harm. "Katy," the wizard called to her gently from across the long table. Katy's eyes popped open when she heard her name, and looked at the wizard like a frightened deer. She couldn't bear his gaze. His eyes were a pale blue and reflected the sky, but she remembered how they blazed red as fire in a fit of rage. She sank down behind one of the floral arrangements, and the wizard called to her again. "My dear, is something wrong?" Gelzuin said in a tone that actually sounded friendly. "I must admit, I was rather hasty and could have handled things a bit better. I'm sure you'd agree," he chuckled. "Can you ever forgive me? Now that we're alone and away from all that noise and clatter, we can sit and talk." Katy held her breath. Say nothing," she said to herself. The wizard smiled and looked on with genuine concern. "Please, you don't look at all well. Are you sure you're all right?" Katy peeked up over the flowers. "Yes," she said, then quickly clasped her hands over her mouth as though a bird had just escaped from her lips. Say nothing," she reminded herself. The wizard smiled like a devilish fox. I was beginning to worry. I know you've traveled a long way, and thought you might like a little something to eat before you leave, before you return home. Katie's eyes lit up. Home? I'm going home? She said in surprise. Gelzuin grinned. Why, yes, of course you are. Surely you cannot stay here in the Norworld. Home is where you belong. I could have the dwarves take you back immediately if you like, unless of course you'd rather have something to eat first. The clever wizard paused to let Katie look at the banquet table. There were exotic dishes wonderfully prepared, surrounded by mounds of fresh fruit. There was shrimp and lobster, steak, sausage, and omelets, a whole turkey, pheasant under glass, a broiled duck smothered in mango sauce, and even a roast pig glazed with honey and covered with juicy pineapples. Then there was a world of desserts. There were cookies and donuts, puddings and pies. There were even milkshakes and ice cream sundaes with toppings of all kinds. Soon Katie was smiling at all the delicious food in front of her. With that and the promise of home, the wizard didn't seem so bad now. Gelzuin took another sip of his tea and let out a scrumptious moan of delight. There is nothing I like more than green tea. It is my absolute favorite. He lowered his teacup and paused, then looked at Katie as though a thought had just occurred to him. Tell me, child, what is your favorite food? Katie didn't even stop to think and popped up in her seat. Cherry cheesecake with strawberries and whipped cream swirled on top, she blurted out. My mom showed me how to make it, but Grammy Nan used to make it the best cherry cheesecake in all the world. But that was before she passed away. Katie looked down and her smile faded. Oh, I'm so sorry. Do tell me about your grandmother, the wizard said, trying to sound caring, and did a good job, considering the fact that he hated the old woman, since it was her prayers that had kept them away from the child. The wizard continued cleverly. I get the impression she was quite a special person. She was, Katie said, and seemed to come to life again. The wizard smiled. Now that the girl was talking, his plan was working nicely, until Katie mentioned the Bible. The wizard spit out his tea and nearly dropped his cup. The words stabbed him like a needle in the flesh and made him cringe. In fact, it made him cringe every time Katie said it, and it was all he could do to sit still as she spoke. Nana always read the Bible. She loved the Bible. She even knew parts of the Bible by heart and told us stories from the Bible. The wizard flinched and squirmed and twitched and turned like he was sitting on a tack while the girl rambled on. She had a lot of names for the Bible. She called it the Good Book, the Staff of God, the Word of God, her Pillar of Strength, but I like to call it the plain old Bible. Enough! Gelzuin shrieked and gave Katie a start. The wizard quickly tried to compose himself. I'm sorry, he said slowly. That was a lovely story, but I'm afraid it's getting late, and the food won't last forever, you know. The wizard gave a weak chuckle, and Katie looked at him suspiciously. Tell me, he said, did I hear you say your grandmother made cheesecake? Yeah, Katie said reluctantly. That is very interesting, because you see I am rather fond of cakes and pastries myself. In fact, I do believe we have some cheesecake right over there. Katie looked to where the wizard pointed and gazed at the huge slice of cheesecake that had practically appeared out of nowhere. She couldn't imagine how she'd missed it. Strangely, the more she looked at it, the more it became just like the cherry-topped cheesecake she'd placed in her mind. It was absolutely perfect. The perfect-sized cheesecake with a perfect swirl of whipped cream and pieces of strawberries, with a perfectly plump cherry placed on top. Please, don't be shy. Go ahead, have a taste, the wizard said and sipped his tea. Katie picked up her fork, and when she took the first bite, the wizard could almost feel the white horse within his grasp, and smiled at the human child who was obviously no match for his clever wizardry. Katie ate and talked, and only paused to wipe her mouth and sip a glass of milk. It was then that the spell of enchantment took effect, and she started to change. The transformation was ever so slow. She didn't feel the slightest bit different, but whether she knew it or not, With each bite she took, she was getting a little younger. Slowly, the months and years fell away, and by the time the spell was complete, Katy was as cute as she could be and looked exactly as she did when she was only 9 years old. She was also 3 inches shorter and had to sit up straight to reach the table. She wiggled her mouth. Since her braces had magically disappeared, her face felt different in some strange way, and she couldn't tell how. The wizard watched her carefully and magically refilled his cup of tea. According to the feeble old wizard Marplot, a younger Katy would have twice the innocence and be more likely to remember the knowledge given to her by God. Gelzuin sat back in his chair, ready to put his theory to the test. "Katy, how do you feel?" the wizard asked, and took a sip of tea.
Fine, thank you.
Katy said. Gelzuin nearly gagged with laughter when he heard Katy's new voice. It was higher and squeakier than before, and the fact that she didn't notice made it even more amusing. He pretended to clear his throat and continued, "You have been such great company," he said.
Thank you, Mr. Zuin.
Katy said, and the wizard smiled with delight. She even talked like a 9-year-old. "Have you enjoyed my hospitality?" he asked.
I have.
Katy said politely. "Then perhaps you can return the favor," the wizard said, smiling graciously. Katy frowned.
You mean the white horse, don't you?
The wizard gave a sheepish smile, as though he hoped it weren't too much to ask.
You think I know where he is, but I don't.
Katy said.
Besides, that was a mean trick you played on me, turning that ogre into a horse.
Now that she was a little smaller, Katy was a little braver as well, and the wizard pulled back, pretending to be surprised. "But, my dear, how else could I have brought you here so that you could tell me about the real horse?" Katy thought for a moment. Then her eyes lit up with excitement.
The one I saw in the pasture? You mean Snowball?
She said. The wizard frowned at the thought of such a ridiculous name being assigned to the most magnificent creature in the universe. He sat patiently and listened as Katy rambled on and on about the white horse she had seen in the pasture, then finally interrupted. Yes, that is all well and good, but I want you to think and tell me about the other white horse, the one called Majesty. Where is he right now?"
Majesty,
Katy whispered at the thought. Although she had heard him mention the name for the first time in the throne room, it was strangely familiar, then slowly came to her.
You mean the horse from the book. The horse my mom told me about,
she said in a whisper.
I don't know,
Katy replied. The wizard leaned forward. Ah, but you do know, he said, glaring at her wildly. Katy sat there, staring as blank as a chalkboard, and in her innocence, she began to feel sorry for the wizard. He wanted to find the white horse so badly, but all she knew was what her mom had said, and that was hardly anything. When it became clear that the child had nothing more to say, Gelzuin rubbed his chin and tried to think. I know, he said with a look of surprise. We'll play a little game and pretend that you do know. You just start talking and make up a story, all right? Just tell me a story about how to get to the white horse.
But how will that help you if I really don't know?
You let me worry about that. Just tell me a story. The wizard smiled reassuringly. Katy didn't see how it would really help at all, but she decided the least she could do was try to come up with something. The problem was, she wasn't a very good storyteller. The wizard waited while Katy thought. She was trying to think of the kind of stuff her brother would say, magical stuff, stuff that would make a good-sounding story.
All right,
she said and smiled. This time, it was the wizard who sat up in his chair, staring with eager anticipation, and as Katy spoke, he hung on her every word. There are 4 kingdoms you must pass through to get to the white horse, she began. Gelzuin listened, like an attentive child.
First,
Katy said, then paused to think. She was waiting for something interesting to pop into her mind, and then she continued.
First there's the land of the giants,
Katy said. The wizard gasped and covered his mouth to muffle his screams of joy. She hadn't expected that reaction. The wizard uncovered his mouth and whispered, "The land of great discoveries," he exclaimed, as though the place were real and he knew exactly where it was. "Go on, child, go on," he insisted excitedly. Katy smiled politely and continued.
Then there is,
This making up stuff was tough going. What would Jack say, she thought. Then it came to her.
There's the forest of the living trees, which protect the, cloud stones.
Those last two words didn't seem to go together. Katy smiled weakly and wanted to apologize. She felt she wasn't doing a very good job. "Yes, of course!" Gelzuin shouted and made Katy jump. Go on, he said, as though she were about to uncover buried treasure. Katy shifted in her seat, feeling a little uncomfortable. Was she better at making up stories than she thought? Or was it simply the wizard was easily impressed? She looked up into the sky, trying to think of something else to say, and just at that very moment, the little fairy popped right out of the space in front of her nose. Kitch swooped down and buzzed around Katy furiously.
"No, say nothing!"
she shouted, hovering in front of Katy's little round face.
"Mind what the angel told you. Do not speak to the wizard. He is—"
Kitch paused, then drew back in surprise.
What has he done to you?"
The fairy marveled at the little girl, who was now smaller and younger than the last time she had seen her, then glared at the wizard, who threw his arms up in abject rage. His eyes turned red, and he yelled at the sky, which became black as night. Suddenly, everything went dark and was gone. The bright green meadow, the beautiful banquet table with all of its fine food. In an instant, it had all disappeared and changed into something else. They were back in the castle, which they had never truly left, in another dark chamber, and all that remained in front of Katy was a rickety old table covered with a canvas cloth. On it was a single candle dripping wax and a dirty dish with a chunk of rotted cheese set before the child. Her grandmother's cheesecake had merely been an illusion. It was this piece of horrible thing that Katy had put in her mouth instead. She could see where she had nibbled off bits of it, and suddenly the sweet flavor of cinnamon sugar turned to the foul taste of sour milk. Katy nearly gagged as she waved the little fairy aside.
You tricked me,
she said, spitting and sputtering out bits of the stale cheese. Suddenly the great bear and a host of dwarves and woodland creatures flooded into the dark chamber, shouting joyfully. "We found her! We found her! She's here!" they cried, thankful to see the child alive. But Katy only glared at the wizard, for he had indeed tricked her and placed her under his wicked spell. Chapter 7. The Angel and the Wizard. A troop of ogres and grim goblins marched into the chamber behind the dwarves, pushing everyone aside as they made their way to the wizard, then surrounded Gelzuin, who slumped back in his chair and stared at the little girl. "It was all going so well," he muttered.
"Scoundrel!"
the bear growled and shook his paw at the wizard. Gelzuin ignored him and sneered at the sparkling fairy fluttering in the air next to the child. "Meddling fairies," he groaned. Suddenly, something shook the room like an earthquake, and the stone wall behind the ogres buckled. The burly beasts and green goblins staggered out of the way just as the wall caved in, raining down chunks of rock and debris. When the dust settled, Stadia stepped through the gaping hole and stood atop the rubble. "Please do come in," said the wizard with a glance. Katy's eyes lit up as the brave guardian approached, and Jack walked in right behind him. The boy stood on the pile of rocks, looking on in amazement. "Cool!" he exclaimed. "That was awesome!"
Jack, you're here! You're here!
Katy shouted and clapped for joy, but Jack's attention was firmly riveted on the angel. "How'd you do that?" he said, gazing at the big man. But Stadia only stared at Katy, who had been shrunk down to the size of a 9-year-old. His gaze was so intense, Jack finally turned to look at his sister. "Hey, what happened to you?" he said and laughed. Stadia looked the little girl up and down as he marched forward, then reached back and drew an enormous shield out of thin air. "Whoa!" was all Jack could say when it miraculously appeared before them. The shield of faith was bigger than Katy and shone like glass. A thin layer of energy seemed to float over the face of the shield and gently rippled across its surface like water. The angel placed the shield before Katy so she could see her reflection, and the instant she saw herself, she smiled. Her braces were gone. There was no shock or surprise, only admiration for the image that stared back at her. Katy remembered what it was like to be 9, and recalled she rather liked that time in her life. She was cute as a button, as Dad would say, and looking at herself only brought back fond memories. Her response was not what the angel had expected, and Stadia withdrew the shield, which vanished into thin air as quickly as it had appeared. Katy looked up at the angel and tried to look as sweet and innocent as she possibly could.
"I spoke to the wizard,"
she said, rubbing one bunny slipper against the other. Stadia looked down on her. "I know," he said. A moment passed, and when Katy realized that that was the extent of his anger, she smiled and turned to her brother excitedly.
Jack, wait till you see,
she said, and hurried past the angel. Katy pointed at the creatures huddled together in the shadows.
"All of the animals can talk. It's amazing."
Jack looked around, peering into the darkness, trying to take it all in. "This place is great," he said. "It's like some kind of realistic dream."
"It's not a dream, Jack. It was your traveling spell, remember? It brought me here. It worked. It really worked."
Jack tried not to look utterly horrified as the reality of it all began to sink in. "It did?" he said, unable to stop his eyes from glancing at the creatures standing in the shadows. Katy nodded. "How?" Jack said in amazement, as though it was the most impossible thing imaginable. Katy shrugged.
by accident, I guess.
"You mean that... Hey, where are we?" he asked, and looked afraid, since the place they had arrived at was far more impossible than the spell that had brought them there. The fairy flew in front of Jack, and the boy stepped back from her shimmering light as Kitch announced,
This is Coravandia, eastern region of the Nor world, grand domain of great King Bromwyn, born of the Fineland, who sits upon the Vandian throne.
The fairy turned aside and gestured.
That is until he showed up.
Kitch said, and pointed behind her. The boy gazed past the glimmering fairy and peered at the dark figure seated in the shadows.
"Who's that?"
Jack said in a hushed whisper. Katy glanced over and wished he hadn't asked.
"Gilzuin,"
she said, and winced as though someone had broken a plate in the kitchen. Jack's mouth hung open as he stared at the master wizard himself. Gilzuin rose to his feet, his shiny bronze robe flickering in the dim torchlight as he loomed out of the darkness to meet the angel, who glared at him angrily. "What have you done to her?" The angel's voice filled the room, rumbling low and steady like distant thunder. "Is there no honor in you? No honor at all among your kind?" There was a flash and another tremor that shook the castle. Katy backed away and turned to look out of one of the open portals in the stone wall. From there she could see storm clouds gathering in the night sky as the angel spoke. "I turned my back, and like a coward, you take advantage of an innocent child." Lightning crackled in the billowing darkness, and thunder shook the land. Katy looked at the angel, then gazed up at the night sky. It was as though the sky reflected his anger, and his words were followed by thunder. The ogres and goblins stood behind Gelzuin, then shrank away as the power of God was revealed in his messenger. But once again, the wizard was unimpressed. "You would challenge me to test your strength, but such power would shake this castle to its foundation. Look around you. Surely you would not wish that any harm should come to these poor creatures as a result of your holy wrath poured out upon me," Gelzuin said slyly. "As for the child, I assure you she is unharmed. Look at her. She is the picture of innocence, and you have me to thank for it." Stadia was hardly amused, and held his piercing gaze upon the wizard. "Anyway, you are too late. She has already told me more than I needed to know."
"Then release her,"
Stadia demanded. "When I am done. And now that you've been good enough to bring me the boy, you will mind what you say, and be careful to use the door the next time." Stadia grabbed his sword.
"You try my patience, wizard. Do not presume to tell me what to do. I have only one lord."
The wizard beckoned to the angel to come closer, and when they were face to face, he spoke so softly only Stadia could hear. "The girl will do as I say, because I possess her brother. His soul belongs to me now, and is mine to do with as I please. Remember, he is a non-believer. He bears no light. You cannot protect him." Stadia sneered as the wizard backed away and turned to face the boy. "Welcome, Jack. I have been expecting you."